So Nick is the president of the American Atheists. He's a seasoned civil rights and civil liberties activist with more than a decade of political organizing and leadership experience with many of the nation's most prominent political organizations and progressive nonprofits. He's a native of Michigan, and Nick studied political science at Albion College before working in Raleigh, North Carolina, managing a voter outreach office that registered more than 5,000 new voters and knocked on 25,000 doors in 2 months. If you've ever done that kind of work, you know how impressive that is. That was all leading up to the 2008 election. I'll abbreviate this a little bit, but I do want to make note that Nick has been on a lot of media, Washington Post, CNN, Time Magazine, and he's also been on Fox News programs, Spirited Debate, Hannity, and Fox and Friends. So don't be afraid to be an aggressive audience. He can handle it. So again, it's my pleasure to introduce Nick Fish.
Thank you, Butch, for that very kind introduction. I will say I'm completely fine with a more aggressive audience as long as we don't trend into white nationalism. I think you're far better than Fox News. So you can basically throw anything at me from there. So I've been with American Atheists since 2012, and I've been serving as president for about the last year. And I'm going to talk a little bit about our approach to activism. And I'm going to maybe shove this a little over so I can wander, because I'm kind of a free-range speaker. But I want to talk about the way that we as a community do activism and the way that we do what we do and why it is that we do what we do. Why are we here? So let's start by just talking about our vision. What does it look like for us to win, right? Our vision has to be about one core thing, and that's building a better world for ourselves, but also for those who come next. That's what humanism is all about, right? Finding human solutions to human problems. The notion that no one else is fixing this, so we have to, right? This isn't about us hating religion. This isn't about us hating the religious, certainly. It's not even really about fighting religion per se. It's about what is standing between us and this better world for ourselves and for our kids and our kids' kids. So what does that vision look like? What does winning look like in this case? Well, I think the first one would be a world where laws, in particular, are made from the best evidence we have available, but also from our shared values. That's what we talk about when we talk about secularism. But we also want equality. We want not just laws that protect all of us, but protect us all equally. It's about framing inclusion as a positive value, as having a seat at the table. It's not just about the negation of bad things. It's also about the positive stuff. Previously, a lot of the ways that we've approached secularism in this country has been about keeping religion out of the public square, ending those practices. Well, those are important, but we also have to recognize that in this country, religious freedom is protected under the Constitution. And so inclusion, including our voices, including atheists and humanists and secular voices, in the discussion is part of the way to get toward that equality. It's not just, let's force religion out, because that really puts people's defenses up, right? But also, it's a world where freedom of conscience is universal and free from coercion or prejudice. This isn't just about what the government looks like. This isn't about what our policies say. This is about our communities. This inclusion, this freedom from coercion and prejudice and persecution is something that I know all of us feel when we're living our day-to-day lives in communities where religion is assumed, where our families push us out or aren't fans of the fact that we don't go to church on Sundays, that we're here instead. We want people to be free from that. We want young people to be free from that. We know that children are being forced to conform to religious pressures. that they're being kicked out of their homes because they no longer believe. They're being forced to go to colleges and universities that are giving them worthless degrees, or kick them out when they change their minds about something, when they do what all of us do in college and university and form a better opinion about things. They lose their scholarships. They get kicked out of college and can't ever get their transcripts. They can't get their credits. So now they have to go back to college somewhere else if they want a degree. And I think we can all agree that that's not a world that we want to be living in. That social pressure to conform to the expectations of 40 years ago, of 100 years ago, of 2 centuries ago, of 2 millennia ago, that's what we have to fight against. That's what we're working on. And so part of this is figuring out how to measure if we're hitting these things, if we're hitting what we're reaching for. So in the public policy arena, in public policy and legal stuff, this is relatively straightforward. It's certainly not easy, but it's relatively straightforward to know if we're succeeding, right? We can look and say, okay, did we repeal this bad law? Did we get rid of federal laws that give special privileges and treatment to religion? Did we repeal RFRA? Did we repeal RLUIPA, which the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act? Slightly less. I don't think anyone knows what that is, but it's a law that literally says in some cases that a church can build a giant printing factory in a residential neighborhood because they're printing religious tracts. And this particular neighborhood, it's very important to them that they be able to build there because Jesus, I guess. So we don't need a fire plan for when our giant vats of chemicals used in the printing presses explode. We don't need a fire plan. This is a real case, by the way. This was in California. It would look like us ending ceremonial deism right here in Pennsylvania. Right? We have this issue of the invocations in your state house, where they have said, well, the invocations can only be given by a monotheist, a person who is religious. They can't be given by an atheist or a secularist or a humanist. We could eliminate religious exemptions. Again, here in Pennsylvania, we're dealing with a adoption and foster care agency in Philadelphia that wants to use your tax dollars to discriminate, to tell LGBT couples, to tell atheist couples, to tell basically anyone who doesn't subscribe to their very narrow definition of who would make a good parent. They don't want to have to provide them with adoption services. We could get rid of all of that. That's a very easy thing to measure. The problem with basing all of our wins, or all of our looking to this and saying this is the only measure of winning, the problem here is we either need to become the majority of voters in America, which seems like a really big thing to ask. It takes a long time. Or we need to make it a salient voting issue for majorities of both political parties, which again seems like a pretty big lift. The other way that we can accomplish this is by convincing religious allies that these laws are not in their best interest, that repealing them doesn't endanger their rights in any way. I think we all know asking people to give up a privileged position in society, in law, in any of that, is a really difficult thing. But it's even more difficult when they distrust us, when they question our motives, when they don't know us as people, when they don't just distrust us, but they view us with outright hostility. In many ways, I think we've prioritized the wrong thing. We've prioritized getting these wins in court, using the court system. But we haven't prioritized changing people's minds. We haven't prioritized breaking down those barriers that exist between us and religious folks. And so how do we do that? Where do we start? I think for me, the place that we start is changing attitudes. I'm not saying that this is a false choice. I don't want to frame this as an either or, that this is, there are only two options here. I'm saying that we have to try to move the needle on achievable policy goals while also improving the lives of Americans. I want to be clear about that. There are people dying right now. There are children who are stuck in the foster care system, in a system that is complicated and convoluted and actively harmful for many. And so we should focus on achieving those policy goals. But the places we're most likely to achieve those policy wins are in partnership with communities that have already done a lot of the hard work of changing people's minds. So I'm talking about LGBT organizations. I'm talking about women's issues, reproductive health care, public education, things like that. Things that we all in this room care about. That's where we need to make inroads and find partnerships and build bridges with those communities and not view ourselves as this siloed, walled-off garden of humanism, but go out there and be more involved in all these other issues. But it's important for us to quantify what we're talking about. How do we measure if we're changing people's minds? Which sounds like a really strange thing to ask because we're talking about feelings. We're talking about squishy, that's not data. Well, yeah, it is. we can measure this stuff. And there are a couple ways. We can use what are called thermometer ratings, how warmly people rate us. But we can also measure explicit and implicit bias through a lot of really clever techniques. But it's important for us to quantify what we're talking about. We as a community say we care about data, right? We care about what the science and reason says. So let's look at what the science and the reason and the data say. So let's start with attitudes toward atheists with these thermometer ratings. And I apologize, it's a little hard to read, but you can sort of get the gist of it here. This is what's called a thermometer scale. So starting at, people can rate how warmly they feel about particular communities on a scale from 0 to 100. 0 being, I feel completely cold to this community, I don't want to have anything to do with them. 100 to, I feel very, 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 very fondly, warmly toward this community. And so they average the mean thermometer rating for a bunch of people on different identity groups. And you can see here, 2014 to 2017, every group went up, except one. Evangelical Christians, sort of stayed level. But everyone else improved. Muslims went from 40 to 48. Atheists went from 41 to 50. So our community now has a resounding meh from the general public. It's great. And this isn't, by the way, just to clarify, one question that I get a lot is this saying 50% of people rate us some way? No, that's not what it means. It means the mean rating, the average rating people gave for us was 50, right? Jews, 67 degrees, Catholics, 66, mainline Protestants, 65, evangelicals, 61, Buddhists, Hindus. But again, everything improving, except for evangelical Christians. But here, this is where things get really interesting. This is broken down by age group, all right? So you can see atheists were actually in the same level as evangelical and mainline Protestants. Buddhists, Catholics, Hindus, all kind of a little bit above, but look how condensed everything is. Every single group is between 54 and 66, very much condensed, compared to 65 plus, mainline Protestants up at 75 degrees, atheists down here with Muslims at 44. So for folks who are 65 plus, please go sort your community out, figure out what's going on, crack some skulls. No, don't do that. If anything, do the opposite of cracking skulls. Be very nice. But you can see just how interesting this compression is. People are starting to almost like not care, right? Goes from, oh, atheists, I really don't like them. Oh, Protestants, they're great. To, whatever. I feel pretty neutral or neutrally positive to everybody for the younger generation. I think that's very interesting. And so that's one way that we can look at how things are changing, how things are improving. We can compare this year over year. Another way, and this is super complicated, so I apologize in advance. This is what's called implicit bias. And these two figures here, these bar graph with the little confidence interval thing, this is from a psychology professor at the University of Kentucky named Will Gervais. And it's spelled Gervais, like Ricky Gervais. But his name is Will Gervais. You can look up his research. Very interesting. He writes a lot about atheism and secularism and attitudes toward that. Very good resource if you're looking to learn more about what we can do. One of the really interesting things he did was measure both explicit and implicit bias against atheists. His hypothesis on this was people, the religious faithful in particular, tend to distrust us for two reasons. First, as sort of a mental shorthand that a lot of us do about our shared values. That is, they're using religion as a shortcut to determine morality. We're guilty of this too, right? We hear if somebody is maybe an evangelical Protestant, and we go, oh, that says a lot about them, right? But the second reason was due to a lack of familiarity with us and a belief that atheists are relatively rare in their community. Now, the second one there is very interesting because it actually runs counter to how prejudices usually work, especially around racial lines. In general, a racial minority group, as it becomes more and more prevalent, as it becomes more of a quote-unquote threat to the dominance of the majority, that's when things start to get really distrustful, when people really start to have a lot of bias against this group, because they see that group's existence as a threat to their dominance, right? But for atheists, the opposite was true. And his hypothesis was that this might be because there's a tension that exists between this belief that atheists are these immoral monsters and the fact that we tend to be really hard to identify. We don't walk around, with that scarlet A, right? It's much easier to identify, for example, a racial minority that you distrust than it is to identify an atheist. In other words, as the perceived number of atheists increases, religious adherents aren't seeing a bunch of murder. They're not seeing, bedlam on the streets as all these immoral monsters infiltrate their community and start eating children, right? They're not seeing that. And so because of that, there's this tension in their minds. And so what they did is they actually just told religious adherents that there were more atheists. And then their explicit and their implicit distrust of us decreased by just telling people that there are more of us. Because it really leans into that tension of like, oh, well, if half of people are atheists, it can't be that bad because, again, what my pastor told me isn't being played out. And that's what happened here. So atheists rare, they told people, and this I think was done at a college or university, they said at our university 5% of people are atheists, and this is the distrust rating. Higher is worse, the a higher level of distrust. But then they said, they told a different group of people, atheists are common. 50% of our students are atheists. And then the explicit bias went down to 50. Went down to 6. The really fun one is here on the implicit bias. And on implicit bias, they don't say, hey, how do you feel about atheists? They do some interesting survey tactics to try to suss out biases that people don't necessarily even know about. For control, again, we're sort of similar to where we were on the levels here. But when they primed people with, hey, atheists are really common, the bias went way down. Because people were primed for, oh, well, there's a lot of atheists around, so it must not be that bad. The other part of this, though, is getting to know us. And that's the second part of what Gervais was talking about those personal connections. And so religious groups rated more warmly to those with personal connections. Do you know someone who is a Jewish? If you did, you rated them 72 on the thermometer. If you didn't, you rated them 58. And this is the case for literally every group here. For people that don't know atheists, 38. So people who don't know any atheists are actually the lowest rated group on the thermometer scale, even lower than Muslims, even though the average or the total for rating for Muslims was lower. So people who don't know atheists at all rate us very, very coldly because they have this image of us. It's drilled into them at church, right? And so this speaks to what we're talking about here, about being better at marketing, which sounds so gross, right? We're talking about our lives, we're talking about the lives of kids, and we're talking about marketing here. But it's important because it shines a light on who we are. It breaks down these preconceptions. It allows us, though, to talk about our shared values, to talk about what it means to us to be humanists, to be atheists, to be secular. It allows us to connect with people on a very personal level through shared experiences, shared stories. When we're addressing particular policy proposals, it's not enough for us just to say, well, it's going to reduce poverty by 2.5%, or it's going to help 184,000 children. The data is important, but even more important in terms of convincing people, in terms of reducing stigma, is making a personal connection. We know that the number of atheists, agnostics, humanists is higher than what people will self-identify as. We know that because we can ask about it in very tricky ways that sort of get to, the latest data I saw was something like 10 to 15% of people might be just atheists, straight up atheists, as opposed to the 3 or 4% who will say atheist. But so what we need to do is provide that context, provide that story so people feel more comfortable identifying that way. And people don't view it as this foreign other. But also we need to provide support for people who are leaving religion. Demonstrate our shared values in a way that creates kind of a permission structure for somebody to walk out of church and say, I'm not really losing anything here. Yeah, I'm losing the dogma, I'm losing the religious tradition maybe, but I can walk over here and come to this group that meets on Sundays, where if my kid is sick, I know that somebody will come to my house and look in on them if I have to work. Or if something happens to me, somebody will show up with dinner for my kids. Or if I fall on hard times, I know that I can fall back on a community that cares about me. That's really important. That's something that the church has gotten, a 200, 300-year head start on us. But we have to provide that as well. And so telling our stories is the key to that. Why does telling stories work? Why isn't it just enough for us to throw data at people and throw facts and figures at people and say, well, the data's right here, come on, you should figure this out? Well, it's neuroscience. It has to do with the way that we evolved. And again, this is a community that says we care about science, and what the science tells us is that science and data and facts and figures aren't enough. So we should listen to that. We should take that seriously. If you want the science, anybody here a neuroscientist? Anyone? No? No? Great. So you know this probably better than anyone, and I'm probably going to get a lot of this wrong, but that's okay. Feel free to correct. Storytelling is about, one of the things that it does is it prompts oxytocin production, and it motivates people to engage in pro-social behaviors, cooperative behaviors, a desire to come together as a community and help one another. And the way that we've evolved to tell stories, the way that our society has evolved to tell stories, things with narrative tension and drama and specific characters we can focus on. And again, it sounds really gross, right? Because I think we've been conditioned to look at the way that churches exploit people and use kids as tools, as pawns to tell their stories. So what we have to do is do a better job of telling the stories, but do it in a non-exploitative way, right? The other side has kind of corrupted this for us. Big commercial interests have done this as well. Like look at Facebook keeping us, engaged on Facebook in maybe less than ethical ways, where it's akin to the way that people approach drug use, right? There's been a lot of stories about that. But we can use some of this. We can use these tools in a way that's consistent with our values to illustrate the concrete using emotionally resonant language. So I'm going to show you a video that I think illustrates this really well and is especially topical given what's going on right now in a lot of court cases and a lot of law battles. So I'm going to show this.
When I met Nicole, she was thinking she wanted like 7 kids.
7 kids. I just love kids.
So we actually met on a bus stop.
Seriously. And I thought he was cute, and I gave him my number.
And we've been stuck together ever since.
Yeah. And sometimes only if I took the later bus.
When I met Nicole, she actually had a nephew, Nicholas, that was about to be taken away from her younger sister, and we just kind of stepped up and were like, we'll take him in while you try to get everything back together. And when it ended up being that she couldn't, we just decided to keep him. And then, from there we learned about all the other kids that needed homes. And when we found out that, we're like, well, why don't we try to see if we can foster to adopt?
We tried a few agencies, but they did not accept Sam.
And why?
Because Sam is transgender.
I mean, everything seemed like it was going okay until when they were doing the paperwork to do the background check and the home study and all that. And they're like, hey, did you go by any other names? And I told them, yeah, this was my old name. Their whole, like, kind of demeanor just kind of changed.
It's from friendly to, like, distant.
After that, they just kind of were like, we can't help you. We didn't want to try again because we got rejected twice from 2 different agencies, and I didn't see how going to another agency or
Will make
another
any
agency
difference.
was going to make any difference. Arizona law, there's no protection, so even if we would have tried to fight it, there's not a lot you can do. I was just browsing online, and I found a foster care licensing agency, and they had the LGBT flag, and so I called them up, and I found out that, yeah, they're inclusive to everybody. It's kind of like it was meant to be. After 9 months, we got our license to foster. Our second placement just went back home, and we're waiting for another placement. It's been a lot of fun so far. Coming from a childhood of having to conform to what everybody else wants to, becoming who I actually want to be, I can relate with children who are going through a lot of stuff, and they're trying to figure out, like, who am I?
So this video tells a very real story about people who are harmed by religious privilege in our nation's laws. And when just yesterday, the Trump administration's Department of Health and Human Services announced a new rule that went into place immediately that said that all HHS grants will no longer be required to adhere to LGBT protections or anti-discrimination protections in the provisioning of that money from the grants. We're talking about 40% of the overall Health and Human Services budget, $500 billion with a B, that now is no longer protected from religious discrimination. And they are championing this as a massive victory for adoptive and foster children. Because now these poor religious providers that just want to put people in homes can now do so without being forced out of the adoption and foster care ecosystem by being forced to adhere to things that violate their faith. I'm adopted. I was adopted as an infant. My family is not especially religious. I don't know that at least one of my parents would use the word atheist, maybe the other. But they weren't asked ever, what church do you go to? What religion are you? Do you believe in God? The only question that they asked is, are you going to put his interests first? And if the answer is yes, then what are we talking about here? And we have to be able to use these emotionally resonant stories to talk about the larger issue. The larger issue being that 500,000 young people are in our nation's foster system at any given time, and about 125,000 are waiting for adoption. Those are big numbers, and those big numbers are powerful and tell the story of the scope of the problem, but they don't tell who the problem is affecting. And that's what videos like this do. This is why we've partnered with groups like the HRC and the Every Child Deserves a Family Act, making sure that adoption and foster care not only protects LGBT people, but also protects atheists and non-religious people for the first time ever. We got that in there, American Atheists, by working with these groups and building that bridge and saying, we're here for you. We support this. We will go out there and encourage our people to vote on this and encourage people to lobby on this and go out there and fight for this. And because we walked in and said, here are some stories of people in our community that have been turned away, not because they were LGBT, but because they weren't sufficiently religious. And these are qualified, loving parents that just want to provide a home for people. And this is also for the young people themselves who are non-religious. For people under the age of 25, 24, I think it's something like 40% of them are non-religious. And that number just keeps getting bigger as you get younger. And so when the only foster care agency in your county is a Christian ministry, and they only place families with evangelical Christian families, or they only place kids with evangelical Christian families, I have a feeling that your rights as a non-religious young person are not going to be protected. And I have that feeling because we've talked to non-religious foster and adoptive kids. And so that's how we can use those stories to make laws better and then to try to pass a good law that protects everyone. But we also have to know what the problems are. We have to know that adoption and foster discrimination is a problem in our community. And we know it, we have some anecdotes. But as the saying goes, the plural of anecdote is not data, except for sufficiently high values of anecdote. But so that's why we started this secular survey, which I'm sorry to say I prepped this, and then we closed the survey 3 weeks early because the response was overwhelming. But I'll talk about that here in a second. We wanted to collect data. We don't have much good data about our community in this, and that's a shame. It's a scandal that we don't have better data about who we are and about the problems that we face. We just completed it. Our original goal was to survey 5,000 to 10,000 people in 5 weeks. We hit that in 5 hours. By the end of the first day, we had 12,000 people complete the survey. We launched it at noon, and by midnight, we had 12,000 people. By midday the next day, we had 16,000. By the end of the first week, we had 25,000. And by the end of the second week, this week, that was Friday, we had 35,000 people had taken the survey. It's the single largest thing that we've done together as a community. We took the lead on it, but I want to thank, obviously, all of our partners, American Humanist Association, FFRF, CFI, secular students, black nonbelievers, ex-Muslims of North America, Secular Coalition for America. The list sort of goes on and on and on. We got buy-in from everybody because this is about building capacity for all of us. This is truly a rising tide lifts all boats moment because we all need this data. And we have the expertise, we have the people to put this together, and thankfully we did. And now we have to actually analyze the data, which will be a longer process. So why do we do this? Like I said, this is to build capacity in a few core areas. Number one, starting with understanding. We need to actually know what the heck is going on here. We need to know what life experiences people in our community have. How do you face discrimination? Do you face discrimination? What does it look like? Accurate, scientifically rigorous research allows us to understand even the more experiential problems that people have, right? This isn't a demographic survey. This was an experiential survey. This is about what people had experienced as non-believers in their communities. We need to understand how religion impacts their day-to-day lives. Are they discriminated against in employment? Do they experience, family alienation and so on? We don't know, but we will. It also helps us with advocacy. Anyone who's ever done any lobbying knows that the two things you have to have are the data and a personal story. Well, we've got a few personal stories, but we don't have data. We don't have great data other than here's how many secular people are in your community, Congressman. How widespread is the problem this bill is trying to solve? How many people in our community in this community are treated differently because of this? We can rarely answer those questions right now because we just don't have good data about it. But that's what we're trying to do here. This matters not just in federal lobbying, but in state lobbying. When we're talking about 35,000 responses, the great thing there is we can extrapolate a lot of that out to each individual state because the response rates in all of the states were high enough for us to get reportable numbers, which is great for you all going out there and fighting in your state capital. But also funding. To put a number on the scope of this problem, in 2015, foundations gave away something like $60 billion in grants, and the federal government gave out something like $700 billion in grants. But none of it, or very little of it, essentially zero of it, went to atheists and secular organizations who are trying to meet the needs of our community. A whole heck of a lot of it went to religious groups that want to discriminate and that this administration is allowing to do so. But for the private grant making, they require data. They want to know where you're starting, and they want to see that whatever you're doing has helped. And unless we can have that data and show that things have improved, we're not going to get any of that money. Groups like Alliance Defending Freedom, the Heritage Foundation, First Liberty, so on, they have a combined budget of something like $250 million. If you added up the combined budgets of all of the atheist and secular organizations that do this work on our side to protect church-state separation, you're probably talking maybe on a good day, 15 million, maybe, on a really good day. I'm not including the ACLU in there. Obviously, the ACLU is giant, but that helps. But, you know, they have a lot to do, so we need to focus on our issues too. But that's the scale of the problem that we're talking about here. So we need to close that gap. Inclusion, seat at the table. This is what I was talking about. Inclusion as a positive value. If we can point to the experiences people have and just how many people we're talking about in things like political organizing, opening every meeting with a prayer, and we can say, you know, listen, there's this large segment of people in your community for whom religion is a very troubling thing in their past, who have experienced a lot of discrimination at the hands of churches. Maybe just skip the prayer, or maybe invite a humanist chaplain in to give the invocation. Here's why this matters, here's how many people we're talking about. That helps people who are actually committed to inclusion as a positive value to do a better job. My experience of this is they just don't know, and so when you bring it up and you can point to some data, they'll say, oh, I didn't even think about that, and then they do better next time. And we can help with that. And finally, research. We as a community care a lot about gathering knowledge, right? We care a lot about learning more about the world around us, about our community, about the larger society. And this is a great way for us to deepen that understanding and knowledge. It really lays the table for future investigation, future research into who we are, who makes up our community. Like I said, 35,000. It's a big number. We're really pleased with that. We were overwhelmed at the response in terms of just our emotional response, but also the, oh my God, this this really went crazy. Let's think about closing early and doing a fundraiser so we can actually process all of this data. So if you want to learn a little bit more about that, and if you didn't take the survey, I'm sorry that we sort of ships passing in the night here, but the data will be available in the new year, and we'll start releasing it, including to local groups that want to better understand the community around them. But if you like that approach, feel free to visit secularsurvey.org. You can make a tax-deductible donation there to help support the survey. As I said, we were a little overwhelmed at the response, both in terms of the numbers and also for our budget. It's totally fine. It's a good problem to have, but if you'd like to help support that sort of work, we'd certainly love to have you. This is just, though, the first step, and we have a lot more steps to take. But I'm excited that we're taking that first step. Thank you. So I'm happy to answer questions as well.
Thank you, Nick. If you have a question for Nick, raise your hand, and please, I'll bring the microphone over to you, speak into it so we can get it on the audio, on the video. And if you're going to have a follow-up question, hang on to the mic.
Questions generally end in question marks and are in one or two parts, maybe.
And just to note, the 35,000 responses you got on that survey, one of our members pointed out the survey to us. John put it in our newsletter, so probably about half of those are because of us.
Yeah, that sounds right. That's hard data right there.
Okay.
I apparently took the survey but didn't remember, but she remembered because I sent it.
That speaks to how easy it was to take the survey. It was just like it was like 10 minutes. It was like, do it on my lunch break.
It was a piece of cake.
Yeah, it was very easy. So, yeah, happy to answer any questions. Yeah.
I don't know. We hear all the time about how young people are nuns.
Yep.
But to me, nun means nothing.
Right.
And if you look around the room here, there's none of these young people here.
Few.
Yeah, me too. I'm only 78. So what's going on?
Yeah. No, it's a great question. And the answer to it, I don't know that I have a great answer for you yet. But again, the plural of anecdote is not data, but from my anecdotal experience, it's not a salient identity for a lot of people because they're more concerned about all of the other things that are out there. They don't think about religion as a cure for social ill, but they also don't necessarily think about religion as the source of social ill. Instead, they're devoting their time to very worthwhile fights like environmental work, like reproductive health, like LGBT organizing, like transit, or any other number of things. The way that I've encouraged and the way where we've seen some success, and again, anecdotal, is from our groups who have decided to consciously get out there and get more involved in the things that people care about. Like, you all are individuals. You all have things that you're very committed to that you want to help improve in the world. Lehigh Valley Humanist doesn't have to take a vote on whether the organizational position is going to be on, increasing, a millage, or voting yes on a millage in order to add additional funding for public transit to help people get from this community to this community, or whatever. But if you care about that, you just maybe provide a time in the group to announce that, like, oh, I'm going to go to this community meeting to talk about this, and if anyone would like to come, we can go. And we can say, hey, I'm so-and-so from Lehigh Valley Humanists, just out here because we support this, or because we care about this environmental issue, or because we, as a group, a lot of us care about this LGBT issue, so we're here to help and do whatever we can, and we're just to be good sort of foot soldiers on those issues. And what has happened in those groups of ours, those affiliates of ours who've taken that model, is people in that will hear that and say, oh, I didn't know that there was a humanist group. That's great. What do you guys do? And you can say, well, we have social events. We get together for a talk every other week or so. We have dinner groups. We have board game nights. We also do activism. We do a lot of these things that the churches have done historically. And we provide a social outlet, but we also provide an outlet for activism and an outlet for organizing and an outlet for service. And take that all of the above approach to what you do. Because if all you do, and I was listening to the events that you were talking about earlier, it seems like you do a lot of different things. That broadens the base of like who is available to come. If all you did was have this every other week or so, you'd get a lot fewer people, because the only people you're going to attract are the people who are interested in hearing from some schlub up here talking about whatever, right? You're not going to get the people that want to go out there and clean the park. You're not going to get the runners who, every Sunday want to go run, right? That's another event that some of our groups have done. They just, as a social event on Saturdays, a few of them get together and do runs. And they do it because they're non-religious and they like running. And they don't want to worry about going to the church running group where there's going to be a prayer circle beforehand, and then there's the expectation you go to church or whatever. They just want to get together and run, and they do it as sort of an affiliate of the larger group. Not everybody comes to everything, and that's fine. But what we want people to do is get out in the community, be more active. Because what a lot of younger people say to me is, I don't see how a Ten Commandment monument is that big of a deal when my friend over here who is gay was just kicked out of their home, or I personally can't go get an abortion even though I have an ectopic pregnancy, right? I'm going to go devote my resources to this as activism. But if you can provide more social support and more social outlets for people who share a lot of common issue with you, or share a lot of common concern with you, that's a way to grow the group and to hopefully bring people in and welcome them, and that's been somewhat successful for a number of our affiliate groups, is just getting out there and being more active in the community. But it doesn't happen overnight. It's not the sort of thing that you can do like, well, we invited people, and then they didn't come. You have to. It's a lot of hard work, and I'm not going to pretend that it's not. But a lot of churches are experiencing the same thing. So it's not. This is not a unique problem to humanist atheist groups. It is somewhat more acute, though, in certain ways. In part because we don't force kids to come to meetings every Sunday and indoctrinate them, right? But the side effect of that is that they don't view it as the main activating identity. You know, they care about a particular issue, and that's what they go work on. So that's been my experience, but we'll report back once we start digging into this data, and hopefully that'll answer the question a little bit better. Yeah.
Okay, another question from Diane.
Thanks, Nick. I have a comment and a question. So I've been involved with this group since the beginning, and I know that we've discussed a lot of our frustrations and stuff, but I think I think that our biggest challenge is geography. We are so spread out. It's like we can't get involved in the community because what community would it be? Anyway, I was wondering, speaking of stories, how were you received on Fox News, and who did you go on Hannity, or tell us about that?
Yeah. So on your comment, I'll start there because it's easier. No, the comment is correct and is exactly, it's hard. And like I said, I don't want to pretend that there's like, check these 4 check boxes and magic, your group is a success, right? It's really hard. But don't feel like, you have to be in all places at once. But sometimes all it takes is 1 or 2 very passionate people that just show up and are shameless in their promotion of the group. People who are advocates for the good work that you do, and you're going to like a community group and you get on that speaker roster and they have like a public comment section, and you get on that speaker roster and you do it every week or however often they meet. And every single time it's, hi, I'm Nick with Lehigh Valley Humanists. Over at Lehigh Valley Humanists, what we do is da-da-da-da-da-da, and I'm really happy with Lehigh Valley Humanists. By the way, the reason I'm here is, and you're shameless promotion, and it's fine. Because people need to know that you're here and that you're engaged on these issues and what you do. And somebody will come up to you and, get some cards, print some cards with just an email on it, if that's all it takes, and carry those with you. And say, we meet on this day, swing by. We'd love to have you. And, that's, I know it's hard. And I know, especially in communities like this where I'm from the Midwest, like everything is 20 minutes away, right? That's just how it is. And it's hard. But you have people who are geographically diverse. And, sometimes you may have to go help somebody in the community next door to you, or 2 communities over, or 5 towns over, or the next county, or whatever it is. But yeah, find a few opportunities for that and really do it. The second thing, Fox News. So Hannity is interesting because Hannity, I think, is a true believer. Bill O'Reilly was sort of like a circus clown where like he knew it was an act, mostly. I think he started to kind of drink the Kool-Aid at some point. But it was like this, I'm doing this to get a rise out of people. Hannity is a true believer. Hannity is like the inmates are running the asylum sort of thing. Like it used to be at Fox News kind of a wink, wink, nudge, nudge. It was like, well, we don't really believe this. We're just using this to rile people up. But then the people who actually believed it started getting hired because they started making a name for themselves in the media. And that's kind of what happened with Hannity. But yeah, he's terrible. I've been invited on Laura Ingram's show 3 times in the last year, and we turned them down all 3 times because it's more important to me to live our values and this was when she was right after she had, what did she do? She had basically said something that was like, oh my God, that was straight up white supremacy. Like not structural. Right. She had literally said something about, it was, our communities are so much cleaner when they don't have immigrants in it. Like she had said something like that immigrants make the communities dirty. And that was right after she said that. And they reached out and said, hey, would you like to come talk about this random church state issue? And I said, nope, I would not, because I'm not going to lend any amount of credibility to your program. Because I have better things to do with my time than speak in that echo chamber. And, somebody's got to break through occasionally, but I'm not going to do it on their show. I'll happily do Fox and Friends again. I would happily do, Neil Cavuto or any of the midday stuff. But, I will not go on Laura Ingram's show because she is just an outright white supremacist. And I'm not going to support that. Fox and Friends, it's funny. They were very friendly. I actually got invited to Christmas services. I got invited to church while I was there last year because they thought that it was, well, you just haven't been to the right church. I mean, how familiar is this to all of us, right? You just haven't gotten to the right church family. I was like, well, I've got a pretty good family already. Thank you. I'm pretty well set. I think Mama Fish would be really ticked off if I chose to go with you to your church instead of going back to Michigan for Christmas. And the point of my being on there was to basically say, listen, Christmas is not about the religious stuff. Christmas is about spending time with your family, about giving gifts to your kids, about doing service, about working at a food bank, and having a great time with the people you love. It's not about the religious stuff. That's not the thing that most people say they care about when we interview them. And we did that once. We went out to Times Square and we just said, hey, what's your favorite part? What do you like best about Christmas? And literally the only person that was like, going to church, was the guy who really carefully read the media disclosure that we had people sign beforehand. Because it said, it was like, oh, I released da-da-da-da-da, in the very tiny letters, American Atheists, in the disclaimer. And everybody else was like, oh, yeah, I'd love to do an interview and sign the thing real quick. This guy sat there and read the whole thing for like 2 minutes. And then when we were like, okay, you ready? We get on camera and we're like, oh, so tell us, what do you do for Christmas? What's your favorite part? And he literally just like looked dead in my eyes and was like, going to church. And we went, oh, okay, great. Are there other things that you do on Christmas that you enjoy? And he was like, church. And it was very strange. It was like, I'm making a point now with my really aggressive eye contact. And that's how a lot of it happens. There are people who call us on Christmas Day, call our offices. And my phone rings when my office phone rings, my cell phone rings if I'm not in the office. And so I see it, and I get a voicemail. And there's a person who leaves a voicemail, and it's inevitably it's this person who calls and they said, I just wanted to wish you a Merry Christmas. It's like, boy, that's a heck of a season's greeting there. I'm beginning to question the sincerity with which you hold the birth of your Savior when the best thing you have to do on Christmas Day is to call my atheist ass and leave an angry voicemail. Like, what are you doing with your life? That's the thing. We don't call Catholic churches on Easter and say, Happy Resurrection Day, ha! Like that doesn't even occur to us as a thing to do. And so, if people are threatened by our contention that you can have a really fantastic Christmas without the religious stuff and enjoy it without the God stuff and just have, enjoy the cultural parts of Christmas, then I question the sincerity of their belief if they're threatened by that. And that's why I think it's important for us to push back on that narrative that we're, these angry people that don't want anybody to have fun. It's like, no, we want you to have more fun. I have a heck of a lot more fun because when I don't have to get dressed in church clothes and can just lounge around all day, and believe me, I am an expert at lounging around all day, I would much rather do that on Christmas and not have to worry about being presentable. And so that's what we do, and it's great. So maybe try it someday, and you'll see that you're not missing a lot, actually. It's pretty great just to hang out with your family. So anyway, other questions? There have to be other questions. I'm not that articulate. So. All right. Well, thank you so much. I'll be around, and so yeah, I'm happy to have further conversations. Thank you.